Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, The Abolitionist Approach to Animal Rights. I'm Lucia Guy, the co-founder and the managing director of the Institute of Animal Law of Asia, an educational research center that focuses on animal law issues in Asia and the world. At the Institute of Animal Law of Asia, we provide research projects which include animal law in Asian countries on topic, on category, and on species animal law articles. This year, we have also launched two projects enhancing legal regulations for aquatic animals in Kazakhstan and farmed animal welfare in mainland China that are supported and sponsored by the Center for Animal Law Studies, Lewis and Clark Law School. We also have our news source, Asia Animal Law Bulletin, that provides the latest updates on animals in Asia. And last year, we launched the Alliance for Animal Law of Asia, an international networking campaign that aims to cooperate with national, regional, and global organizations. You can find us on social media by searching iAnimal Law Asia on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And also check out our website, ilasia.org. Today's webinar is organized under my project, Enhancing Legal Regulations for Aquatic Animals in Kazakhstan, within the Global Ambassador Program launched by the Center for Animal Law Studies, Lewis and Clark Law School. This wouldn't have been possible without the CAL support. Our guest today is Gary Francione. Professor Francione is the author of numerous books and articles on animal rights theory. He has developed the abolitionist theory of animal rights and maintains that veganism is a moral imperative. We'll be answering questions after the presentation, so please drop your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you so much for speaking for us today, Professor, and I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the 6 principles of the abolitionist approach to animal rights. If you want a more detailed discussion, Anna Charlton and I have a book called Animal Rights, the Abolitionist Approach, which you can get on Amazon, and goes through the principles in more detail. Obviously, I don't have the time to go through them in the detail that we go through them in the book, so I'm just going to sort of sketch out the 6 principles, and then I will answer your questions. The first principle of the abolitionist approach to animal rights is that every sentient being, by which a sentient being is a being who is subjectively aware, a being that can experience pain, experience pleasure, but is basically subjectively aware. That every sentient being has the right not to be treated as the property of others. Now let's unpack that a little bit. What do we mean when we talk about a right? I assume, Lou, is it correct to say that most of the people who will be watching this are law students, or at least many of them will be law? Whether you're a law student or a lawyer or not, we all of us use the concept of rights quite a bit, but yet most of us don't ever think about what a right is. And what is a right? Well, there's been a lot written about that, but for our purposes, all we need to focus on is a right is a way of protecting an interest. We all have interests. Some of us have we have common interests. We all have interests in, our lives and our liberty and our free expression and things like that. But we also have individual interests. Some of us like some sorts of music, and some of us like other sorts of music, or some of us, like to play golf, and some of us don't like to play golf. But we have different interests, and those interests can be protected in one of 2 ways. They can either be protected consequentially, so we protect them to the extent that protecting them generates some sort of good consequences, or we can protect them even if the consequences of protecting them are not particularly good. Let me give you an example. I have an interest in my expression of my ideas. Okay, we all do. We all have an interest, a preference, a desire, or want to be able to express ourselves. Now, my interest in expressing myself, we say, is protected by a right. I have a right of free speech. Or if I say I have a right of free speech, what does that mean? It means that my interest in my expressing myself is protected even if the consequences of my expression are negative. Even if people don't like what I say. If I did not have a right of free expression, I wouldn't be able to do the talk I'm giving today, because most people in the animal protection movement don't agree with me. And they strongly don't agree with me. So um, and I suspect that much of what I say makes many of them unhappy. So if my interest in my expression were dependent on my um, on the consequences of my speech, I probably wouldn't be able to speak. But my speech is protected even if people don't like what I say. That's what we mean when we say when we talk about having a right. What we mean is our interest, whatever interest is protected by the right, is protected even if the consequences of protecting that interest are negative. It doesn't mean it's absolute. I don't have absolute right. I can't defame people. I can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater, for example. So, I mean, there are limits. I mean, it's not to say that I have a right of free speech doesn't mean that it's an absolute right. To say that I have a right of liberty, what does that mean? Well, it means that my interest in being free to move about as I wish does not depend on consequences. I get to exercise my interest in my liberty, even if others wish that I would not exercise or are unhappy by my exercise of that interest. It doesn't mean that my liberty is absolute. If I commit a crime and a jury of my peers finds me guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, then I can be put in jail. So my liberty will be then abrogated. So when we talk about, say, having an interest, having a right rather, what we mean is we have an interest, whatever we're talking about, whatever the subject of the right is, means that interest that's protected by that right is protected even if the consequences of protecting the interest are negative, or there are negative consequences to protecting it. There are obviously negative consequences to protecting a right of free speech. Some people won't like what is said. There are, interestingly, one of the debates going on right now is we have people imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, on the same island where Cuba is, and the United States has taken people and put them there because they are suspected, not convicted, but they are suspected of being terrorists, and so their liberty is being truncated. Why? Because it makes us comfortable. It makes some of us comfortable to think that these people are unable to move around. Their liberty has been truncated as a consequential result of our being happier about having people we think might be terrorists having their liberty abrogated. But they haven't been, and one of the reasons why that's such a controversial thing to do is because their liberty interest, which many of us think should be protected by a right, particularly since it's an American operation, even if it's not on mainland soil, we think that their interest in their liberty should be protected and should only be abrogated if they are tried in a court of law and they are proved to be terrorists. Otherwise, their liberty should not be abrogated simply because it makes us feel more comfortable. So what we do with the people on Guantanamo Bay is their interests in liberty are protected only consequentially. And those of us who disagree with that say their interests should be protected irrespective of consequences. Even if it does make some people feel more comfortable, it doesn't mean it's okay. So that's what a right is in a nutshell. I mean, we could get into a great deal more complexity, but we don't need to. It's just a question when we say, what does a right mean? It's an interest that is protected in a non-consequential way. Now, we can disagree about what rights humans have. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of disagreement about what rights humans have, but there is agreement. I think it's fair to say there's agreement that most of us think, as a matter of fact, I would imagine almost all of us think that humans have an interest in not being property. That is, their interest in not being property should be protected in a non-consequential way. They have a right not to be property. They have a right not to be slaves. Right? I mean, we can disagree about whether people should, there are a lot of disagreements about whether people should have health care or what sort of, social benefits should people have or whatever. But you don't really hear people talk about whether or not we should reinstitute slavery. Perhaps there are some people who think we should have that discussion, but they generally keep quiet because most other people find that would be a completely unacceptable thing to propose or for which to argue. Now, that doesn't mean slavery doesn't exist. Slavery does still exist in the world, but nobody defends it. Nobody defends it. Why? Because we believe that that in order to be a member of the moral community at all, you can't be property. You can't be a slave. If you are a slave, if you are chattel property, then all of your interests, including your interest in your life, can be valued by somebody else, your owner. And there's a real difference between slavery and various forms of discrimination. They are qualitatively different. When we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about whether humans who are already regarded as persons, who are not regarded as chattel property, are being treated equally with other persons. And then we can have debates about whether particular treatment constitutes equal treatment or whether certain things have to change in order for people to be treated equally, et cetera. But when we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about whether human persons are being treated equally or in a morally acceptable way. When we're talking about slavery, we're not talking about human persons. We're talking about things. We're talking about beings who have no inherent or intrinsic value. They only have extrinsic or external value. I'm sorry, my dogs are barking. They only have extrinsic or external value. They are things. They are pieces of property. They are bought. They are sold. They are commodities. All of their fundamental interests can be valued by someone else. That is what distinguishes chattel slavery from discrimination. With discrimination, you're talking about human persons, and then the question is, are they being treated equally or in a morally acceptable way? Whereas when we're talking about slaves, we're not talking about human persons. We're talking about pieces of property, chattels, things, beings that have only extrinsic or external value, beings that are bought and sold. And most of us, I would like to think all of us, but obviously it's not true, but most of us, indeed, slavery is one of the few things that customary international law prohibits. It's against the law of every nation on earth, at least as far as I'm aware. I do not believe there's any law that allows for chattel slavery. You know, there are lots of laws that have the effect of harming people and discriminating against people and treating people terribly, et cetera, but there are no laws that authorize chattel slavery. It's against the law of every nation on earth, as I say, as far as I'm aware, and it's certainly against one of the few norms of customary international law. It's one of the few things that's against customary international law. There are very few things against customary international law, very few. Slavery is one, torture is another, but very, very few things. And so it is, I think there's general agreement. I think it's safe to say that that we agree generally that slavery is if a human is a slave, the human is not a member of the moral or legal community. The human is outside the moral and legal community. All right. Now, the problem is animals are property. They are things. They have an economic value. All of their interests can be valued by somebody else, their owner. All right. And so they have the status of being chattel. Chattel slaves had the status of being chattel. Animals also have the status of being chattel. They are things. We buy them. We sell them. We use them for our benefit. Okay, now you say, well, wait a minute now. Didn't you just say you have 5 dogs? Yeah, I do. I've got 5 rescued dogs. And 4 of them are cruelty cases. One was born from a mother in a puppy mill. She was not born in the puppy mill. She was born the day after her mother came out of the puppy mill. The other 4 are cruelty cases. Do I love them? I absolutely love them. Do I think of them as my property? Absolutely not. I think of them as members of my family, but they are my property. If I say, you know what, I'm trying to give this talk to Kemep University in Kazakhstan, and my dogs are barking and it's annoying me. So could I put them in my car right now, right this very minute, and drive them to the shelter, which is a kill shelter, and drop them off and say, if you can't find a home for them, you may kill them, because that's what you sign. You sign a waiver. You sign a transfer of property actually over to the shelter that if they can't find a home, they have the right to kill the animal. If I wanted to, I could take the dogs in the backyard right now and kill them right now. They are my property. I love them. I regard them as members of my family, but that's only because they're my property and I get to value them how I want to value them. I can value them high. I can value them low. I can give them lots. I can accord them lots of value. I can accord them 0 value, and I can take their lives. That's the reality. They're property. So animals are property. All animals are property. Animals, wild, non-domesticated animals are basically, for the most part, I mean, they're the property of the state. And the state will at various times allow people to go and hunt animals and sort of reduce the animals to their possession, et cetera, in the hunting season. But generally, the state maintains, the animals are owned by the state. The animals on not on people's property are owned by the state for the most part. Now, so we have this idea that animals are property, which I've just introduced, but this is fundamentally at odds with the idea that, wow, there's something really wrong with chattel slavery. So we have humans. We reject the idea that humans are property, but animals are property. And that's something that we not only don't reject, but we accept. We accept sort of ubiquitously. I mean, they are property. Now, my argument is that if we're going to do that, we've got to be able to, the principle of equal consideration, you've got to treat similar cases similarly, requires that we justify what is it about animals that allows us to treat them as chattel property, whereas we recognize that treating any human as chattel property is to remove that human from the moral and legal community and make that human a thing who doesn't have any intrinsic or inherent value. How do we justify that difference? And the answer is we can't. Whatever characteristic we point to, if we say, well, animals are not rational, humans are. Well, there are some humans who are not rational. I mean, and we don't treat them the way we treat animals. As a matter of fact, there are some humans who are not rational. Some might argue the previous president of the United States was not particularly rational, but he was president of the United States. And so what characteristic is it that justifies our treating animals as property, where we recognize that it's wrong to treat humans as property? We recognize all humans, irrespective of how smart they are, or how not smart, or how beautiful, or how not beautiful, whatever their characteristics, we recognize that every human has the right not to be property. Every human has the right not to be property. Why do we not recognize that when we're talking about non-human animals? And the answer is there is no good answer to that. Whatever characteristic that animals have that we think differentiates them from humans and justifies our treatment of them as property, some group of humans will have that characteristic. But yet we would never think about treating those humans as pieces of property. All right. I mean, this is not to say we treat all humans equally. We don't. Let's say we've got two humans. One is one's a talented mathematician. The other one is severely mentally disabled and is unable to add any quantities at all, has no mathematical ability at all. Do we treat them equally? The answer is yes and no. If the question depends on the question. If the question is, who does Kemep University hire to teach math? They're looking for a math lecturer. Who do they hire to teach math? Well, they teach, they choose the person who's got facility in mathematics, somebody who's a mathematician. But if the question's a different question, you wouldn't choose the person who's mentally disabled. That wouldn't be fair to the students, nor to the person that you were choosing to teach mathematics who could not do it. But if the question's a different question, who do we use, as a forced organ donor? The intelligent person or the person who's mentally disabled? And he says, we don't use either of them. We treat them equally, that all sentient humans are equal for the purpose of none of them being used exclusively as a means to the ends of others. All humans are equal for the purpose of not being used exclusively as means to the ends of others. All right. And why do we not extend that and say it doesn't really matter whether animals have minds like ours or how intelligent they are, or whatever they, what characteristic do they have that allows us to treat them as property, where we see that that's inappropriate to do with respect to any human, irrespective of their cognitive capacities? The answer is there is no answer to that question. There is no good answer to that question. There is no characteristic that justifies our treating them as property. So the conclusion of the first principle is that animals have one right, the right not to be property. Now, you say, well, it's just one right. What does that do? And the answer is it does a heck of a lot, because if you recognize that one right, it means you've got to abolish all institutionalized exploitation of animals. End of story. One right, you recognize that one right. All institutionalized exploitation of animals, use of animals for food, for clothing, for entertainment, for research, for sport hunting, for all of the uses that we make of animals. Those uses all rest on one thing and one thing alone, and that is that animals are property. They have no value except the value that we give them, and we can use them exclusively as means to our ends. Once you recognize that they have a right not to be property, boom, institutionalized exploitation has to come to an end. So that's principle one. All sentient beings have, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about sentience in principle four, but all sentient beings have an interest in or have a right rather, not to be used as property. Principle number two, abolitionists reject animal welfare regulations and single issue campaigns. If it's wrong, if we cannot justify using animals as property, and animals have the right to not be used as property, what that means is we've got to abolish animal exploitation, not regulate it, not make it more humane or this or that. I mean, we've got to abolish it. Now, let's talk about the animal welfare. The ubiquitous paradigm that we all live with about animals is the animal welfare paradigm. Now where does that come from? Well, it comes from Britain, basically, in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. 19th century, when people like Jeremy Bentham said, look, animals don't have an interest in continuing to live. They're not self-aware, but they do have an interest in not suffering. And so therefore they matter, and we've got to take their suffering into account when we decide what our moral obligations are with respect to them. But be clear, Bentham did not think that there was anything wrong with using animals, but not at all, because he didn't think they had any sort of interest in continuing to live. So killing them per se was not a problem. The problem is that they only have interests in not suffering. They don't have an interest in continuing to live. As a matter of fact, he discusses eating animals, and he basically says, animals don't care that we kill and eat them. They don't care about that because they don't have an interest in their lives. They're not self-aware. They don't have a connection with their future selves. They only have an interest in not suffering. And as long as we pay attention to that interest in not suffering, then it's all right for us to continue to use animals. Now, and that's, by the way, the position Peter Singer more or less takes. I mean, he tends to modify his position sometimes, but his basic position is the Bentham. I mean, he's a utilitarian like Bentham, and he maintains that with few exceptions. The primary difference between Singer and Bentham is Singer thinks that some animals are self-aware and do have a connection with their future selves. And so he would disagree with Bentham. Bentham didn't recognize that animals were self-aware at all. And so Singer recognizes that some animals are self-aware, although it's not clear what that means in terms of what our normative obligations to them are, because Singer is not entirely clear about this. As a matter of fact, this is I have a new book that's out called Why Veganism Matters, the Moral Value of Animals. And that is a primary thing I discuss is the development of the animal welfare standard and how Singer developed the principle from Bentham and why it simply doesn't work. But we'll talk about that later. Okay, so and I mean, and the other main thing in this book is I take issue with the idea that animals don't have an interest in their lives. I think that is absurd. As a matter of fact, I can't understand why anybody, really, I honestly am bewildered as to why anybody believes that, but it is ubiquitous in the population generally and in the animal movement. That is, Singer dominates the animal movement. And for the most part, Singer doesn't think the animals we routinely exploit are self-aware. And so, I mean, and don't have an interest in continuing to live. I just find that just remarkable that anybody thinks you can have a sentient being that is indifferent to whether the sentient being continues to exist or not. I mean, think about this for a second. What is sentience? Sentience is a means to the end of continued existence. So to say that a sentient being doesn't have an interest in continuing to live is like saying a being who has eyes does not have an interest in continuing to see. I mean, it just makes no sense. It has never made any sense to me. It continues to not make any sense to me. But it is a position that is very much part of the modern animal movement. This idea that animals don't have an interest in continuing to live. They don't really care that we kill them. They only care about how we treat them and how we slaughter them. I think that that's nonsense. I think animals do have an interest in continuing to live, and I think that any sentient being, even if that sentient being does not have complicated cognitive characteristics, is connected to a future self, that being's future self, in terms of the next second of consciousness. So, I mean, that's the main point that I discuss in this, is this idea that animals don't have an interest in continuing to live, which is part of the animal welfare ethic. It is part of modern animal rights, or no, I wouldn't say modern animal rights philosophy, because Singer's not an animal rights person, but it's part of modern thinking, you know, in terms of Singer's, in terms of Singer's thinking. And I think it's wrong. So you have Bentham in the 19th century basically saying animals have an interest in not suffering, but we can use them. So what we've got to do is deal with their interests in not suffering. But the problem is their property. All right, their property, and that means their interest. Animal welfare regulation, my friends, does not work. And I realize that that's a controversial proposition, but I believe it has the virtue of being true. They do not work. Animal welfare regulations provide that level of protection that is necessary to accord to an animal's interest in order to exploit the animal efficiently. Let me give you an example, one of many. The Humane Slaughter Act in the United States, passed in 1958, requires that an animal be stunned, unless it's for kosher slaughter or halal slaughter, but an animal be stunned before the animal shackled, hoisted, and cut. Now, why do we have this rule? Well, we have this rule because if you go back and look at the legislative history, Congress, the United States Congress, recognized that if animals are not unconscious when they're actually pulled up by their back legs and someone's cutting into them, they move around a lot, and they incur carcass damage, and they cause worker injuries. It's simply not economically efficient to not stun the animals. And interestingly, in 1958, chickens weren't covered by the Animal Welfare Act because they were small, so they were moving around. They're not going to hit workers, and they're not going to have the same economic impacts. Now you have groups like PETA and the Humane Society of the United States promoting the idea that we need to have greater welfare regulations for chickens. We ought to get them under the Animal Welfare Act, because it is economic. I mean, if you look at the arguments that PETA and that HSUS make, they're basically economic efficiency arguments. Yes, the economics with a chicken and a cow are different because one is small and one is big, and one has a lower economic value and one's got a much greater economic value. But the reality is that when chickens are moving around a lot because they're basically conscious, and the lines as they're going down the kill line, they're hanging upside down by their feet in these clips, and then they go into this electrified bath, and then they get, there's a knife that's set at one level, and it hits their throats and stuff. But there's a lot of carcass damage that happens in the handling of these animals, and a lot of meat gets thrown away. It's not economically efficient. A lot of workers get injured because you got hot water, you got electricity, you got whirling knives, stuff. People get injured. So there are worker injuries, not the same sorts of worker injuries that you would have if you had a cow hanging upside down, by her back leg, fully conscious. You'd have a different situation. But there are still worker injuries, and there is still carcass damage. And what PETA and HSUS argue is that if you look at the studies, and they're right, if you look at the studies, it's economically efficient to go to asphyxiation, that we ought to go to asphyxiating these chickens rather than killing them in the way that they're presently killed. If you were starting a chicken slaughterhouse tomorrow and you did not use controlled atmosphere killing, or basically gassing the chickens, you would be acting irrationally. Animal welfare regulations are not about morality, they're about economics. You can think of animal welfare regulations as a set of instructions that we give to animal owners as to how you should rationally exploit your property, and what you would do if you were fully rational and you had full information. And about that's it. Basically, I mean, do some animal welfare regulations go above the level of efficient exploitation? The answer is yes, some do marginally, but they can't go that far above because it'll affect supply demand. And we're talking about a world in which we no longer have national markets. We have international, we have regional markets. So if nation one has some regulation which protects, and then actually the case study here is Britain. Britain, which is now no longer part of the European Economic Community, but was until recently, they had slightly higher animal welfare regulations, and their producers were at an economic disadvantage, even though the regulations were not dramatic, didn't make a heaven for animals in Britain. The differences between animal welfare regulation in Britain and say France were such that it gave the French farmers a significant advantage over the British farmers. So animal welfare regulations are about efficiency and about economics. They're not about morality. Animal welfare has nothing to do with animals. It has to do with us. It makes us feel better. If we think animals are being treated humanely, whatever that means, we feel more comfortable about continuing to exploit them. I think animal welfare regulation is a waste of time. I understand that a number of you are in law school studying to become, you want to become animal lawyers, and you want to improve regulations for animals. Good luck with that, because the economics will constrain it. Particularly when you're talking about food animals, which is the large, every other use of animals is virtually nothing compared to the use of animals for food. Every year in this world, we're killing 80 billion, an estimated 80 billion land animals, and we don't even know how many sea animals. That, the lowest estimate I've ever seen is 1 trillion. So you're talking about in 1 year, we're killing more animals than the number of human beings that have ever lived on the planet since human beings crawled out of the swamp and started walking around or whatever. And so, it's an enormous, unfathomable number. The bottom line is animal welfare regulations will do virtually nothing to make any significant impact on our treatment of animals. Animal welfare regulations are useless, and I think they're counterproductive because they make us think that there's a right way to do the wrong thing, and it encourages us to continue to exploit animals. Another aspect of principle two is abolitionists don't support single issue campaigns, things like the anti-fur campaign, or the eating dogs in Asia, or these or killing dolphins in Japan or whatever. These things are really terrible. Don't get me wrong. It's not that I think it's a good idea to kill dolphins or to eat dogs or or to wear fur. I think that these campaigns are silly, and I think they're dangerous, because what they do is they give people the idea that there's some forms of exploitation which are okay and some forms of exploitation which aren't. So you have these campaigns, like the campaigns against the Chinese and Korean eating of dogs, and you have these campaigns in the United States. We've got a lot of people who aren't even vegan pointing fingers at the people in China and Korea and saying, you're bad because you're eating dogs. Now, I don't think people in China or Korea should be eating dogs, but I don't think people in America should be eating chickens either. So, this idea that there's like some sort of morally coherent distinction between chickens and dogs is just problematic in my view. And I think, in the same way, do I think fur coats are great? And the answer is no, but I don't see the moral distinction between fur and leather and wool. Leather is just animal skin with the hair off of it, and fur is animal skin with the hair still on it, and wool is horribly, wool. People think, well, they just they shear the sheep's happy, No. Shearing is a violent activity. I've seen it happen. It's violent activity. There are also all sorts of procedures that are used with sheep that cause them a lot of suffering and distress. And ultimately, the sheep don't die of old age. They end up in a slaughterhouse. They're shorn the last time, and they go into the slaughterhouse, and they end up being meat like all the other animals. But fur, leather, wool, these are all terrible things. So I think that like an anti-fur campaign is really problematic, because single issue campaigns, for the most part, tend to focus on vulnerable populations. The anti-fur campaign has been vilely sexist. The anti-fur campaign's been going. I've been involved. I've been doing this stuff now for going on 40 years. And the anti-fur campaign was going on back then. It's still going on. The fur industry is bigger than it was back then. And the fur campaign has always been vilely sexist. Just like these campaigns about dog eating are really terribly xenophobic and ethnocentric. I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, look, all you need to do is look at the internet and look at these campaigns about, eating dogs, and look at the vilely racist, xenophobic, ethnocentric statements that are made about, those barbaric Chinese, those barbaric Koreans. Well, what about those barbaric Americans? And so we tend to sort of think, well, they're bad and we're good. I think these campaigns are absurd. I really do. As I say, I don't think that I understand why they happen economically, because animal groups want to have broad donor base. So what you do is you have a campaign against Chinese people eating dogs. So that brings in all the people who are vegans, all the people who are vegetarians, all the people who are eating meat, dairy, and everything else, but they're animal lovers. And they all contribute money to these organizations so that everybody can point their finger at the Chinese, or everybody can point their finger at the Koreans, or everybody can point their finger at the Japanese, whacking dolphins over the head at Taiji. These are bad things. People shouldn't do them. But we do all sorts of things. We may not beat dolphins to death, but we do other things. We do other nasty things to dolphins, and we do things to animals in terms of rodeos and circuses and zoos and stuff. I mean, this idea that somehow it's other people, this is the problem with single issue campaigns, is they encourage the belief that some forms of exploitation are worse than others, so therefore the ones which are supposedly better are okay. And they almost always involve pointing fingers at some group, whether it's women or whether it's Asian people or whether it, whoever it is. It allows us to sort of feel superior and to point our fingers at other people. I think it's a really bad idea. So in any event, so that's principle 2, that the abolitionist approach rejects welfare regulations. They're ineffective. They rest on the idea that animals don't have an interest in continuing to live, which is wrong. They encourage continued exploitation. And like single issue campaigns, like single issue campaigns and animal welfare regulations, encourage continued exploitation because it sort of promotes this idea that, there are some things that are better than other things, and therefore the things which are better are okay for us to do. Principle 3. I'm just trying to keep track of my time here. Oh my God, this never works the way I want it to, but I try. Veganism is a moral baseline. If abolition if recognizing that animals have a right not to be treated as property requires that we abolish animal exploitation, means that we have as a social and political goal abolishing animal exploitation. But what does that mean in our personal lives? Veganism is applying the principle of abolition to our individual lives. And what that means is basically you reject animal use wherever you can, whenever you can. Okay. So, veganism is not a matter of what's convenient for you. It's like, well, I just, I'm in an airport and all I can do is get a banana or some animal products. So I'd rather not have the banana because I'd rather have, no. If you've got a choice, you don't choose to eat animal products. You don't choose to wear animal products. And for the most part, unless you're on a desert island or, you're on a boat in the middle of the ocean or something, sea wrecked, you have a choice. And even when you don't have a choice, it's still not, let's imagine that I'm on a desert island with you and we're shipwrecked on a desert island and there are no vegetables to eat. And a rabbit comes along. Of course, what the rabbit would be eating is a mystery, but let's assume that, that there's a rabbit there. And, is it all right for us to kill and eat the rabbit? And the answer is no, it's not all right. It's understandable why, if you're starving to death, you would kill the rabbit. It's also understandable why, if you and I were on the desert island and I killed and ate you, it wouldn't be okay, but we would understand why I did it. My culpability would be mitigated by the compulsion in the situation. But that is not the situation that most people find themselves in, right? We choose to eat animal products. Okay, we choose to eat animal products. And so my view is that if animals matter morally at all, then we cannot continue to treat them as property. If we cannot continue to treat them as property, we have to abolish animal exploitation. And veganism is the only rational choice. We shouldn't eat meat, dairy, eggs. We shouldn't wear them. We shouldn't patronize forms of entertainment which use them. Veganism is more than just a diet. It's a lot more than just a diet. It's a philosophy. It's basically the philosophy of abolition applied to your individual life. We do not need to eat animals. I mean, I've been a vegan for now almost 40 years and I ain't dead yet. And you don't need to eat animals. You can live a perfectly healthy life. Some people would say a healthier life by not eating animal products. And and it's not a question of, well, is veganism elite because you have to have a lot of money to be vegan? No, you do not have to have a lot of money to be a vegan. Veganism, fruits, vegetables, beans, seeds, grains. That's all. The expensive food, vegan foods that you buy at these high-end grocery stores. I don't eat that stuff for a number of reasons. First of all, it's got too much salt and no nutritive value. And secondly, I don't like to be reminded that I was once not a vegan. I don't like things which mimic meat. I don't like tofurkey. I think that it grosses me out, to be really honest with you. But you certainly don't need to eat that to be, that's not necessary. And as a matter of fact, I would say it's less healthy for you. I mean, I eat basically plant foods and, I eat, and it's much cheaper. We have a website, howdoigovegan.com. We have tons of recipes on that site that are geared to educating people about how to make simple, easy vegan meals that are cheap. Simple, easy, cheap. And now, what about vegetarianism? In my view, vegetarianism is a morally incoherent position. I mean, there's no morally coherent distinction between meat and dairy and eggs. They all involve suffering. They all involve death. What is my view? I mean, some people say, well, if you're an abolitionist, you're just passive. And the answer is that anything but passive. Yeah, we don't necessarily stand around wearing Guy Fawkes masks, holding computers, showing people slaughterhouse videos, right? We don't do that sort of thing. But what we do is educate people in creative, nonviolent ways about veganism. Because if you ever want to change, if you really want to change the world for animals, it's only going to change if we develop a significant population of people who are committed to veganism and who reject animal use on ethical grounds. That's the only way things are ever going to change. And you're not going to do that by encouraging people to eat cage-free eggs or crate-free pork. That's not going to change. It's not going to happen if you encourage people not to wear fur, but leave leather and wool out of it. There's one way we're going to change the world, and that is by getting people to go vegan in large numbers. And before you say, well, that's not practical, it's the only thing which is practical. And if everybody who is vegan today turned one person on to veganism in the next 12 months, and then they turned one person on in 12 months, and they turned one person on, the whole world would be vegan in 15, 16 years. No, that's not going to happen, but it could happen if we were devoted, if we got into the education of veganism and we educated ourselves and educated others about these simple moral ideas and got people to go vegan. We could change the world. We're never going to change the world by pursuing animal welfare reform, single issue campaigns, and things other than veganism. It's not going to happen. Principle 4, sentience is the only characteristic that's required. I reject the idea that animals who are like us matter more morally than animals who are not like us. So this idea that non-human great apes matter more because they're more like us, or dolphins or marine mammals matter more because they're more like us, I reject that. In the same way that I would reject saying that people of color matter more if they're light skinned because they're more like us white males. And so I don't really understand why. And I think it's really dangerous to start saying that the animals who we should prefer are those animals who are like us. I think that's really dangerous because all we need to do is to sort of, if we say non-human great apes matter more because they're like us, well, what that does is reinforce the idea that animals who don't have those sorts of characteristics don't matter. And my view is we ought to be clear that sentience is the only thing that does matter. And it is where humans are concerned. I mean, think about it. If you've got somebody who's mentally disabled, severely, I mean, we're not talking about like severely mentally disabled, but sentient, subjectively aware, is only conscious in the second, but is conscious second to second to second to second. So that person is not a moral agent by any means, because that person doesn't have moral agency, but that person is what we call a moral patient. but is at the really low end of moral. I mean, let's say this person is about as far as you can get to not being aware as the person can get, but the person is still aware. My view is that human is still a person, by which I mean a being with a morally significant interest in continuing to live, and that we should not be using that person as a forced organ donor or as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment. Okay? And so where humans are concerned, sentience is the only thing that matters. But where animals are concerned, it's not, and that's wrong. Principle 5, we should reject all discrimination. You know, it makes no sense to say that speciesism is bad because it's like racism or sexism. Because, you hear this, and people say, oh, well, speciesism is really bad because it's like racism or sexism. On the other hand, we don't really have a position on racism or sexism. That's nonsense. That's complete nonsense. We do have a position on racism and sexism and heteronormativity and all other forms of discrimination. And the answer is they're wrong and they should be rejected. That doesn't mean you have to join everybody else's movement and spend no time on that. It just means that our movement ought to be a movement of equality, and it ought to be a movement that rejects racism and that rejects sexism. I mean, for many years, when I was practicing law, I used to donate a lot of time to PETA, and we had a number of arguments, one of which was about I'd rather go naked than wear fur nonsense, and all the other sexism and misogyny that PETA. I mean, you're not going to enlighten people about speciesism by using sexist imagery and misogyny to promote it. Similarly, you're not going to really educate people about speciesism at the same time, you're saying, the Chinese are barbaric, or the Japanese are hideous because they're because of the dolphin stuff, and everybody else is bad, except us, because they're doing things in various parts of the world. I mean, we ought to reject all that nonsense. It's complete nonsense. The sixth principle is the abolitionist approach is it's about nonviolence. It's creative, nonviolent, vegan advocacy. And I mean, violence is not the problem. It's not the solution, rather. It's part of the problem. If violence was ever going to work, we'd be living in the Garden of Eden right now, because the history of humankind is the history of violence. We engage in violence all the time, and it's always instrumental. It's always, well, we're really sorry that we have to be violent, but it gets us to this better end. It never does. I mean, look at the world we live in now. Look at 2021. I mean, it's a world full of violence, and it doesn't look any better to me. As a matter of fact, in many ways, it's more dangerous than it's ever been. And so this idea that that violence solves problems is a fantasy. And also, there's really no way, when you say, well, should we use violence to help animals? What does that mean? I mean, we live in a world where 95%, 98% of the people eat and exploit animals. So what are we going to do? Declare war on the entire, on all humans? I mean, I always find it interesting when people say to me, well, would you kill a vivisector if the vivisector was using 60 dogs in vivisection? This is actually a question I got once when I was lecturing at a Canadian university. And I said, no, I wouldn't. I said, I don't believe in violence. And the person said, well, then how can you say you're an animal rights person if you wouldn't do that? And I said, well, let me ask you a question. Are you vegan? And she said, yes. And I said, is your mother vegan? And she said, no. And I said, what does your mother eat? She says she eats chicken. I said, does she eat chicken a couple of times a week? And she said, yes. And I said, well, then your mother's killing many more than 60 chickens every year. Is it okay to kill your mother? And she said, there's a difference. And I said, with her mother and the vivisector. And I said, no, there's no difference whatsoever. If we're going to say violence is okay, then that means that violence is okay against, not just against vivisectors, or not just against farmers, non-factory farmers, whatever farmers. They're capitalists. They're fulfilling a demand. If the demand is there, they'll sell beef. If the demand is there, they'll sell bananas. They don't care. They're indifferent. They're business people. So, I mean, this idea that, well, farmers are the problem and let's use violence against the farmers, that is just completely confused way of thinking. And so, it just really, there's really no, the idea that violence is an all right thing to do with respect to, animal exploitation just makes no sense. I mean, you can burn down 10 slaughterhouses right now, and if the demand is still there, 10 more pop up tomorrow, or 10 existing ones increase production capacity. It makes no sense. The only way we're going to solve this problem is not violence against providers of animal products. They're just satisfying a demand by us. You got to change the demand, and the only way you change the demand is by explaining to people. And you know what? On the positive side, I believe many people, I would even say most people, care about animals. Certainly lots of them do, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots. And what we need to do is to educate them about caring about animals means we're not eating them, wearing them, and using them. It's a simple idea. And when you get people to sort of see that and see the moral inconsistency, and then they go vegan. I mean, I give lectures like this all over the world, and I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't waste my time, to be honest with you. Wouldn't waste my time if I didn't think that I was convincing a lot of people to go vegan. But I just think what a great situation we would have if this movement that I no longer consider myself a part of, this animal movement, these charities, these PETA and Mercy for Animals and all these other groups, if they got on board and really promoted veganism as a moral baseline and stopped all this other nonsense and promoting all these other nonsensical welfarist single issue campaigns, imagine how much faster we would get there. In any event, so that's what I have to say. I'm sorry I went over time, and it's like only about a millionth of what I would say if I had the time. So I will now take some questions.
Wow. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was really wonderful. And I personally learned a lot of things. Let's move to our questions. Our first question is, Professor, have you read about eco-socialism? If you have, could you share your opinion about it, and how could this theory help us advocate for animal rights?
Well, I mean, I am a democratic socialist. I mean, I don't know exactly what is referred to by eco-socialism, but I mean, I believe in democratic socialism. First of all, I think it's important to understand something. Every economic system that has ever existed on the planet, communist, socialist, capitalist, whatever, has exploited animals. So there's an idea. There's this idea that if we got rid of capitalism, we would get rid of animal exploitation. That's nonsense. That's complete nonsense. There have been plenty of non-capitalist societies that have exploited animals, like all of them. And as a matter of fact, the exploitation of animals is a sort of a problem for a doctrinaire Marxist, because Marx, as you probably know, Marx took the position that the economic substructure would determine what the superstructure was, and morality and law were part of the superstructure. So it's the economics that determines the law and the morality. But where animals are concerned, animals are always being exploited, irrespective of the economic system. So it sort of presents a problem for the classical Marxist. And so now I believe in democratic socialism simply because I think it's much better for humans, and I think that the present system is not working. But I think it's much better for humans, and I think that and we would be able to achieve more if, for example, there was greater. I mean, the internet has helped democratize access to other people, has helped to increase the access to others. But nevertheless, the main forms of communication are still owned by large corporations, which have and so therefore, if we socialize things more, I think it would make discourse a lot easier. But if I don't know. I mean, I've heard the expression eco-socialism, but it means, I've also heard it mean, if I've heard it from 10 people, I've heard it understood to mean 10 different things. So a specific question, I'm happy to answer.
Okay, next question is, dear Professor, I'm vegan and have learned a lot about animal exploitation and how many issues are interlinked. For example, antibiotics, resistance from factory farms,
Yeah.
working conditions of slaughterhouse workers, inefficiency of animal agriculture due to crop feeds fed to animals in huge proportions, and many more. However, whenever I try to talk about veganism and to avoid animal exploitation altogether, I'm met with absurd arguments such as there are many human issues which are far more important, and veganism is um, elitist with a defeatist attitude. Can I have your perspective on this, please? Many thanks.
Yeah. Look, we live in a world where people have very, I mean, they don't read much. Most people don't read much. They don't, they're getting their information from, television. And so I think what you just have to do is you have to be patient with people. one of the things I see with animal people all the time is that they get very impatient with people, with other people with whom they're discussing this issue. And so if people don't see it right away, and they're not going to see it, not a lot of people aren't going to see it right away. And so when you're talking with someone who says, well, there are issues that are really more important, there are human issues that are more important, I always say, well, wait a minute. First of all, animal exploitation does impact on those human issues. For example, in this country, in the United States alone, we feed enough crops to animals we're going to slaughter. We could feed 800 million people. And so animal agriculture, which involves growing huge amounts of plants to feed to animals that we're going to consume, we condemn substantial numbers of people to starvation. So you can say, well, there are human issues. Almost all those human issues are impacted negatively by animal agriculture. So that's the first point. So you need to know enough so that you can explain this to people. And so, you can't get frustrated with people. I mean, I understand it's frustrating. Please do not think I don't think that. I do. It's very frustrating. But you can't express that frustration, or else you make people think that people don't want to talk to you if they think that you think that they're that they're not smart, or that they're and so you need to really educate them, because most people really don't know about this stuff. I mean, most people will say, oh, well, if the world was vegan, we wouldn't be able to grow enough crops. And the answer is no. If the world were vegan, we'd actually decrease the amount of land that we use right now to produce crops by the size of Africa. I mean, and I believe that's Marco Springman from Oxford's work. Basically, if you were to, we feed many pounds of plants to get 1 pound of flesh so we're feeding many pounds of plants to the animals. If we stop doing that and we were consuming the plants directly, we'd actually have fewer acres under cultivation than we do now. Many fewer acres. We would have many fewer acres the size of the continent, which is enormous, of Africa. So think about that for a sec. Just think about that for a second. And so people really need to understand, you need to educate them. Most people don't know this stuff. And so you need to educate people about that. And you also need to say, look, I'm not denigrating human issues. I think it's great. Like, when I was having a conversation with somebody, a student, who said, you're really getting me excited about this animal thing, but I really want to do legal work with battered women. I said, well, that's great. Do that. But you got to eat 3 times a day. Just eat vegan. You got to buy shoes. You got to buy clothes. Don't buy leather. Don't buy wool. And always, it's not a question of either or. There are important human issues, lots of them. Almost all of them are impacted negatively by animal agriculture. But bless you if you're doing human rights work. It needs to be done. Do it. But just when you do it, you got to eat. Don't eat animal products. You got to wear clothes. Don't wear animal products. You got to, you go for relaxation. Don't go to circuses, or don't go to zoos, or don't go to, SeaWorld or places like that. And so, it's not an either or situation. That's my view.
Thank you. If I want to avoid engaging in single issue campaigns, what is the form of activism that aligns best with the abolitionist approach?
Creative, nonviolent vegan advocacy. Talk to everybody you can about veganism. And it's easy. We have a book. Anna Charlton and I wrote a book called Advocate for Animals. I have it somewhere in this mess called my office. And the area that you see is the only neat area. And if I rotated it around, you'd be shocked at the levels of the piles. Anna and I wrote a book called Advocate for Animals, where we talk about how to discuss veganism with people, and how to discuss it with family members, with lovers, with strangers and stuff. And the focus of the abolitionist approach is creative, nonviolent vegan advocacy. Now, a lot of people have different talents. It's like, I mean, many people are really good with these computers. I'm not. I mean, it's like I started getting anxiety attacks about 10 minutes before our program started today, because I always worry, am I going to be able to log on? But my level of technical competence is very low. But most people have higher level of technical competence, and they're creative. People can. There's all sorts of creative things you can do with the internet, all sorts of creative things that you can do to bring creative nonviolent vegan advocacy to large numbers of people. And so, but don't underestimate the power of one. Don't underestimate the fact that you all move in social circles, you all have friends, you all have relatives, and they care more about what you think than they care about what I think. Or if they don't, you need to change your friends, and perhaps get new families. But your friends care about, if you're a vegan, talk to your friends about why they should be vegan, and do it with patience. Do it, that's the single thing I would say to people, that you need to be patient with people. Animal people are very impatient. If you don't, or many people are, if they don't see, if the person you're talking to doesn't see your position immediately, people get frustrated. As I say, I understand that frustration. I really do. Been doing this a long time. I can talk to you about frustration, let me tell you. But the reality is, if you want to educate people, you got to make, I mean, if I had 5 cents for every time someone said to me, well, but if you're concerned about animals, why aren't you concerned about plants? Now, you can get angry at that person and say that person's giving you a hard time. My view is, when I hear that, when somebody says to me, what about plants? Or what about Hitler? Hitler was a vegetarian. I've gotten that one plenty of times too. Hitler was not a vegetarian, by the way. But even if he was, it's not relevant. When people start talking about Hitler or plants, I always assume that they're really engaged by what I'm saying, but they've got nothing to say in return. So I don't regard that as sarcastic or as off-putting. I regard that as an invitation, that I got, that this is an invitation. This is somebody who is interested in what I'm saying and has no idea how to engage it. So I think we've got to be patient, and we've got to learn how to talk to people. That's an art. But it's an art. It's something everybody can learn. We just need to be patient. That's the whole point of that book. We give you model discussions and things like, I mean, you can talk about this with anybody. I mean, I talk about, not only do I do these sorts of things, but I have discussions when I'm at the grocery store and people notice that my shopping cart looks a bit abnormal because it's got 12 heads of kale or something. And people ask me, what are you doing with the kale? And I say, oh, I'm a vegan. And then I have discussions with people about being a vegan. When I'm in a veterinarian's office, I almost always will start a discussion with somebody. If I've got the time, I will say, well, look, if isn't it funny how we all love our animals and regard them as members of our family, but we all eat animals and things like that. You get into discussions with anybody and everybody you can. Single issue campaigns are never going to work. They never have worked. They never will work. They're just a waste of time. They're a fundraising vehicle for these animal charities. And I'm sorry, but the animal charities are not only are not making things progress, they are actually making things, they're stopping things from progressing, because they're tremendously confusing and counterproductive by promoting ideas like happy exploitation and cage-free eggs and crate-free pork and all of these these single issue campaigns. I mean, I'm sure I know that you're involved in this the aquaria in Kazakhstan, right? That's one of your issues. Yeah, I understand that, and I understand that. But the reality is, as long as people are eating animals, do you really think you're going to get them to care about the animals in the aquaria? That's the question. Do you really think that that's going to change? As long as people, I mean, it's like if people are still eating animals, talking to them about not going to circuses isn't going to make sense to them, nor should it make sense to them. Vegans don't go to circuses. Vegans don't go to aquaria. But to say to somebody, you shouldn't go, to say to a non-vegan, you shouldn't go to an aquarium and look at the dolphins or the porpoises or something, doesn't make a lot of sense to people. Even if you can sort of say, here are some bad things that happen to animals in those contexts, and even if their initial reaction is to say, yeah, that's troubling, 10 minutes later, they're thinking, well, but the animals I'm eating, and the animals I'm eating don't have a great life either. And I think that's okay. So what's wrong with going into an aquarium? This is why when we look at the single issue campaigns, we're looking at it from the wrong end. Do you understand what I'm saying? We're looking at it from the wrong end. Okay, I'm only 3:06, so I'm happy to go until I've got another presentation at 4. So I'm happy to go. I need 5 minutes. I need a few minutes between. I want to get some coffee, and I want to relax my vocal cords. But I'll keep going for at least a half an hour more, if you want.
Yeah, actually, we have like around 20 minutes and we have a lot of questions, but we will try and answer all of them. If
Okay.
not, I left all information in the chat. So next question is, I've been asked about the ethics of eating eggs produced by chickens in one's backyard. The chickens are free and have no interest in their eggs. What is the answer?
Well, I wouldn't eat them. Reason why I wouldn't eat them is that those chicken, what you're doing is you're participating in an activity which perpetuates animal exploitation. If we're going to make this work, we've got to get away from the idea that animals are food or providers of food. And by eating eggs, we're reinforcing the idea that animals are providers of food. Now, those chickens come from hatcheries where, the modern laying hen is an abnormal being that has been genetically selected. They produce eggs constantly. As they get older, I mean, they're still young, and it debilitates. It causes all sorts of bone problems. It causes all sorts of organ problems. And so by perpetuating this idea that backyard hens are all right, we're perpetuating the idea that eating animal products is okay, and backyard hens are still suffering, and we ought to be moving in a direction. I mean, so I have no problem if people want to rescue them and take care of them, but my view is you let them eat their own unfertilized eggs, because it takes a tremendous amount of their because they're producing eggs. A chicken in the wild, a bird in the wild, is only going to be producing a few eggs a year, basically. Maybe I know this number. I think it's 30, but I think, but it's a low number. Whereas these laying hens are producing hundreds of eggs, and so their bodies are depleted. And so if you let them eat their own unfertilized eggs, they will eat the eggs. So they don't have an interest in hatching them, but they have an interest in they have an interest in consuming the minerals that they get and the nourishment they get from eating the eggs. I wouldn't eat them because I think we need to stay away from the idea that animals are providers of food. In the same way that I wouldn't, I mean, if you were dumpster diving, and you found a nice fresh human arm in a dumpster, you wouldn't say, well, I'm going to eat it because it's like a nice warm arm. You say, what's wrong with it? What's wrong? I mean, no human being the arm wasn't cut off for you to eat. What's wrong with eating the arm? And the answer is, well, because we don't regard human arms as things to eat. I'd like to move us in the direction of eggs are not things to eat. Milk is not something to drink or make into ice cream or whatever. Meat is not something to eat, because we've got to move away from that paradigm and move in the direction of sort of recognizing our kinship with these animals and not seeing eggs as things to eat, or milk as something to drink, or meat as something to eat. Or like, a question I've gotten, which is somewhat similar, is what's wrong with eating a hamburger that's been thrown away by McDonald's? And the answer is because meat is not bodies of animals are not things to eat. By eating that hamburger, you're perpetuating the idea that animals are things to eat. As long as that is the prevailing paradigm, veganism is going to be difficult to achieve. That's a shorter answer than I'd like to give, but I'm trying to get through as many as possible in the next 20 minutes.
Okay, next question is from Catherine Batch from Vietnam Animal Aid and Rescue.
Hi, Catherine. Tell her I said hello. I know her. She's a wonderful person.
As you know, this is the bane of my existence in my work in Vietnam, American, dealing with the wild xenophobia and speciesism that comes with this, all from people with bacon grease dripping off their chins. How do you battle the nonsense argument I get all the time that legally ending the dog meat trade, fur trade, baby seal beating is a getaway drug of sorts of of sorts to ending other animal exploitation. I fight this nonsense daily in my job. The argument is always that these are baby steps towards abolition, and there is no evidence of this that I can think of. Is there a legal precedent for this in any other sector in which baby
No,
steps have been a getaway drug towards ending exploitation?
no, baby steps are for babies, not for adults, and not for anybody who sort of. I mean, it's that's ridiculous. This is the propaganda of these animal charities. I mean, who promotes the idea that these are baby steps? These animal groups who promote these baby steps. So what they're doing is they're saying, here's our baby step of the day, give us money. And then next week is, here's our baby step of the day, give us money, give us money. Here's our new baby step. Who's promoting the baby steps? The people who are, these organizations, the organizations are the ones that tell us the baby steps matter. There is no empirical evidence whatsoever that the baby steps matter. I mean, case in point, when I got involved with this 40 years ago, everybody was saying, well, fur was the baby step. We needed to take the step to get rid of fur. That was the step we needed to take. We never took it. I mean, fur industry is bigger than it's ever been. And it hasn't led to, I mean, these single issue campaigns, this idea that the fur issue is this, or any issue is the single issue campaign that's going to sort of get people the light to go on. It's not. It's not. You've got to educate people about the general problem. You need to get them to see it in a different way. It's a real paradigm. I'm using that, and I'm using the expression paradigm shift literally. It's a paradigm shift in how people see the world. So what you need, it's sort of like when, one of the questions I find sort of really can sometimes, not with everybody, but can really sort of get people to focus, is to say, do you love your dog and cat? Yeah, of course I do. What's the difference between the dog you love or the cat you love and the chicken you stick a fork into? Most people have never thought about that. They've never thought about that question. And they say, well, but this is my dog or cat. Okay, fine. But does that mean that, you love your child more than you love your neighbor's child? But so, presumably you'd be horrified if your neighbor's child was killed. So it's like, it's not just a question of like, it's your dog or cat. It's, you think of dogs and cats as having some sort of, or at least many people do, as having moral value. And so what's the difference between the dog or the cat and the chicken? And so that's why I think, and I really do think that these single issue campaigns not only are not useful baby steps that get us to any, I mean, give me an example of where it's ever worked. I can't think of one. I cannot think of one at all. I can think of tons of single issue campaigns that I've encountered in my life, tons of them, and they've never led to anything. I mean, if it were true that single issue campaigns resulted in progress, we'd have progress. We don't. If animal welfare reform led to progress, we'd have progress. We've had tons of animal welfare. What's the progress? I'm about to teach animal law this fall for the 80 millionth time in my life. And the bottom line is things are not really better than they were when I first started teaching the course, 33 years ago, whenever I started teaching it. And so, what's the evidence that the baby steps work? The answer is there is no evidence that the baby steps work. And these campaigns, I mean, particularly the dog meat campaign, I mean, that is such a xenophobic campaign. It's horrifying. I'm embarrassed by it because it is so xenophobic and ethnocentric that it's embarrassing in my judgment. It really is. It's just embarrassing. And, it's sort of like, well, those people are evil. They eat dogs, but we're good. We eat chickens, cows, pigs, and everything. I mean, it's appalling. It's appalling in my view. It's really appalling. Next question.
What's your opinion regarding zoos? Do they ever serve a purpose, or should
No.
animals naturally be allowed to become extinct?
Well, those are different questions. Zoos don't know anything about extinction. The idea that endangered species programs of zoos have stopped extinction in any way is a fantasy. They haven't. There have been some, they have contributed some to species preservation at a cost that is astronomical. Zoos are terrible places. They should not exist. They serve no purpose. They don't serve an educational purpose. All they do is you take your child to a zoo. What are you teaching your child? You're teaching your child that oppression and domination are good things. I mean, I think taking your child to a zoo is obscene. It's like taking your child to it's not a good idea. I mean, I would not take a child to a zoo ever. And I don't think zoos do anything in significant ways. As a matter of fact, a lot of these zoo endangered species programs, they're producing lots of baby animals that they're then selling to other zoos. Endangered species programs are a complete failure from the zoo point of view. What we ought to be doing if we're concerned about species preservation is we ought to go vegan, because it is because we are not vegan and because we have an insatiable appetite for more and more and more and more land, particularly in places like the Amazon rainforest, which is losing zillions of acres every year through clear cutting and burning, so that we can have more land for more cows, so that McDonald's can sell more hamburgers, so that people can continue to consume them. If you're concerned about extinction, if you're concerned about pandemics, if you're concerned about, I mean, you go vegan. I mean, the reality is I'm a vegan because it's the morally right thing to do. But talking about it from a practical point of view, the reality is animal agriculture contributes more to greenhouse gases, and contributes more to the global warming problem than all the burning of fossil fuel for transportation. We had this pandemic. We don't know, I mean, there's a question about, did it come out of the lab at Wuhan or whatever? But the bottom line is most pandemics are zoonotic. They come from animals. They're animal intermediates. I mean, and almost all of them come about as a result of the fact that we're exploiting animals, come about in a context in which we're exploiting animals. So I think this is a really, I mean, we need to, I mean, for practical point of view, we need to stop eating animals and animal products. But from a moral point of view, I mean, animal products are destroying our bodies and destroying the environment. Animal products are also destroying our spirit, because they're making us immune to violence and injustice. I'm not saying that if we all became vegans, the world we would all be wonderful people. I know lots of vegans that I would not think of as wonderful people, unfortunately, but most of them are wonderful people. And but I think it's just if you think about it, most human exploitation, most human discrimination is based on a model of, if we can reduce other humans to animals, we always animalize people that we want to exploit. We animalize them. We did that with blacks. We've done that with Jews. We do that with every group we want to exploit. We animalize them, and then once we reduce them to animals, anything goes. I think if we got rid of the template of, once they're animals, we can do what we want to with them, it would make human discrimination and human injustice not impossible, but a lot more difficult.
Okay, we will answer one more question because we're running out of time. If you don't mind, Professor, I can send other questions to your email, and if you'd like to answer them through email, that would be great.
I'll try. It's my life is a little my life's a little out of control, and has been for the past few decades. I don't know that it's going to get better, but I try to do everything I can.
Okay. So our last question is, could you please? Oh wait, Professor, how could someone effectively help an animal career if the welfare approach is the main one?
I'm sorry?
How could someone effectively help in an animal career if the welfare approach is the main one?
Oh, well, they can't if they're going to practice animal welfare law. I mean, I ran a clinic for 10 years with Anna Charlton at Rutgers University. We started the first one of its kind in the world, as far as I know, and the animal rights clinic at Rutgers. We never did animal welfare cases. We represented humans who had, we represented students that didn't want to dissect or vivisect. We did human rights cases that involved animals. We represented students that didn't want to dissect or vivisect. We represented people who were accused of removing animals from laboratories. Nonviolent, we never represented anybody who did anything violent, but we represented people who were accused of removing animals from laboratories. We represented people who wanted to engage in vegan advocacy, but the police were trying to charge them hundreds of dollars for a permit or something like that. We did human rights cases that involved animals, and I think lawyers can do a lot in that regard. What I disagree with is, lawyers focusing on animal welfare regulations. Or I get 25 solicitations a week from the Animal Legal Defense Fund, about this animal cruelty or that animal cruelty. But the Animal Legal Defense Fund is not promoting. They're not aggressively promoting veganism. They're talking about animal cruelty. Well, part of the problem I have with that approach is it makes you think that animal cruelty is what people do to dogs or cats in particular circumstances. If that's how you define animal cruelty, then I guess the rest of us are not cruel, which is part of the problem I have with this approach, is that it sort of relegates animal cruelty to what people do to a certain number of fetishized animals, rather than, if you're not a vegan, I don't care whatever, what you're supporting is 10,000 times more cruel than most of what you're going to encounter as a lawyer in a cruelty case. It's dreadful. It's absolutely dreadful. That's what we need to sort of change. We need to get people to see. And as I say, I'm also not a big fan of trying to get personhood for animals who are like us, who are perceived to be like us, because I think that that's doing is reinforcing the idea that the vast majority of animals who are not going to have those characteristics, they matter less. And I think that that's wrong. I think that we ought to get away from the anthropocentric model altogether. But I do think that lawyers can be very, very helpful working with people. These are cases. The cases that we did were cases in which the focus was the human who had human rights issues that involved animals. It was the human who was going to have her dog taken away from her because there was some unfair regulation in an apartment complex. But it was the human who was at the center of the drama, but a human interacting with a non-human, rather than the lawyer being at the center of the drama saying, we need to change things and we need to sort of get stronger anti-cruelty laws. Bigger cages is not the answer. And most of what happens in animal law, a good chunk of animal law is things like, negotiating contracts for people who get divorced and, who gets custody of the dog, or you've got somebody who's super wealthy and they want to leave their money in trust for a dog. I'm saying, I'm not saying that those are bad issues. I'm just saying those are not particularly exciting issues to me. If what you want to do is change the world for animals, as a lawyer, you need to help the people who are trying. You need to be assisting the people who are out there trying to change the world for animals, and helping them. So we would do things like, as I said, I remember several times we had situations where people were trying to do education and they were being stopped by the police for various reasons, various bogus reasons. And we stopped that so that they could continue their educational efforts, all focused on veganism. Or the vegan who doesn't want to cut up the frog, the vegan who's a first-year college student, and she doesn't want to cut up the frog. I actually represented somebody who didn't want to cut up a frog. She was a vegan. She didn't want to cut up a frog. We got her, she didn't have to do that. Or I represented veterinary students. Anna and I represented tons of veterinary students, because when we started doing this work, there were very few alternative programs, very few. Now most vet schools have alternative programs, but there were none when we started. We represent students, vet school, who didn't want to engage in dog lab and things like that. And so those are the sorts of things. I think the lawyers can do a lot. I just focused on animal welfare regulation. They're actually contributing to the problem, not alleviating it. You want another question?
No, I think that's it for questions.
Okay. Okay, your
I
choice.
appreciate your interest. And as I said, you can send your questions to my email. I left it in the chat box. I will send them to Professor. And thank you so much, Professor, for this inspiring presentation. And thank you so much for taking your time to give us lecture. It was like super interesting. And don't forget to check out Professor's books. I left the links in the chat box. And have a nice rest of your day.
Yeah,
And
look, everybody, if you're not vegan, please think about going vegan. It's really important. It's the right thing to do for the animals. If you're not vegan, go vegan. Vegetarianism is not enough. Okay, be vegan. Peace. Bye. Bye.
bye.